Hey guys, this is Nia and today I will be painting small landscape paintings. I'm really not good at this subject because I very rarely use heavy water in my paintings. I like something very controlled with little water, especially when it comes to my food illustration, which is my main subject, but I thought that this would be a good opportunity to actually practice a looser way of painting. There were a few of you who asked for landscape painting tutorials and I decided to give this a go and learn along with you guys, but I will still be voice overing what I did and the color palette that I used for this, so hopefully this will still be useful for some of you. So first off, I'm just going to roughly mask off the areas. I want to create 3 panels, and since this is kind of just a practice sheet or doodle sheet, I'm just going to eyeball the measurements. This paper is slightly smaller than A5, but you can work with anything that is comfortable with you. As I mentioned, I'm not used to painting with heavy water, and that's because I'm used to painting in smaller scales. So I'm just going to create small panels, which would be a bit more comfortable for me to work with. Since these paintings took quite a while for me to paint, I'm going to speed through them and hopefully the information is still digestible for you guys. So I'm going to basically move through all 3 paintings and jump around to wait for the paint to dry, and I want to paint 3 different times of the day. So for the first one, I'm going to paint a night sky, the second around sunset, and a third at dawn. For the night sky, I'm going to keep the colors very simple. The colors that I will be using is ivory black, Prussian blue, ultramarine blue, and the tiniest bit of Naples yellow, just to give it a touch of warmth towards the bottom of the panel. I think this would work out quite well if you wet the page first just with clean water, but I'm just going to paint as wet on dry because I want to avoid too much warping. For this, I'm not thinking too much about creating a flat wash anyway. I do want the sky to have a bit of texture, so I'm just placing the colors down as a gradient. The only thing that I was thinking of is keeping the previous color slightly wet while adding the next colors so you avoid any harsh lines. As you can probably see, I'm placing 2 layers instantly for the sky. That's because when I first put down the color, the paint dries off quite quickly since the water didn't seep through the paper completely, so I'm still able to build the colors. I've mentioned this before a few times in my other videos that watercolors always dry lighter, and because I want the colors here to be very vibrant, I'm going to keep layering them until I get the right vibrancy that I'm looking for. Like the first one, I'm going to paint with horizontal lines because I want to create a wispy texture to the sky, because I think that it's actually easier to get away with if it's slightly textured. If this isn't your cup of tea though, please feel free to create a flatter surface. The colors that I use for this one are Prussian blue, purple, red purple, vermilion, and white. At the very top, I mixed Prussian blue with a bit of purple to warm it up a bit, then moving down to just the purple, then the red purple, and then towards the bottom I mixed in white with the red purple and also white with vermilion to create nice soft pinks. For the third one, I'm going to make this panel with warmer tones. So I'm going to start with purple, then moving down to red purple, then vermilion, and then a mix of vermilion with Naples yellow to create a beautiful peachy tone. Then towards the bottom, I'm going to use a light consistency Naples yellow by itself. And I'm using Pentel watercolors for this, by the way, because I actually like the super vibrant colors when I'm painting skies or galaxies with it, but of course you can use any brands that you have available. If you find that you don't have enough of certain colors, it's okay, as we're still going to layer on top and you can still adjust how low you want to take certain colors, and if the certain parts of the panel is too dark for your liking, you can mix white gouache with that tone of color and it will create a pastel version of that color if you need to fix certain areas. So this is actually quite forgiving. Since the colors have mostly dried off, I'm going to add another layer of paint for the first panel, and I'm going to use the same horizontal motion that I used for the previous layers, just because I feel like some of the lighter blues look a bit too light for my liking. After this layer, I'm going to move on to the midground and foreground, but if you still want to increase the vibrancy, just keep layering and make sure that the bottom layers have dried off completely before adding new ones, or else you'll end up taking paint off instead of putting them on. And if you want a faster drying speed, you can also use a hairdryer like I did if you don't have anything to work on in between. Moving on to the midground and the foreground. For the first one, I'm just going to create a couple of mountains and then some pine trees. If you want a more in-depth tutorial on painting pine trees, I do have a video on that. Anyway, the colors that I use for this is a mix of Prussian blue and black to create a more muted blue. And for this, I'm painting in a lighter consistency. Ideally, as it gets towards the foreground, the colors will become more pronounced. So I'm going to add more black and a thicker consistency paint towards the front. At the beginning, I tried working from back to front, as in from the middle ground to the foreground, because I thought that it would make more sense. But later on, I tried painting the other way around, and I actually like that method a bit better because I know how light of a consistency I want my paint to be that way. The only tricky thing is controlling the amount of water to create a softer bottom part and evading the foreground. So I guess it can work both ways, but you can pick your own method after experimenting yourself. The trees are looking a bit too light at the moment, but that's okay. I'm just placing them so I can roughly map out the placing. Then I'm going to move on to the really dark layer now and adjust the trees at the back later on with a thicker consistency paint to balance out the depth. And at the very front, I'm going to use the thickest consistency. I want it to look mostly black as a completely flat silhouette. As you can see, once I've placed down the darker trees, I can work backwards again and add a bit more color to the trees at the back. This is what I meant by adjusting the colors according to the dark colors towards the foreground. So you can always add on as you go. These types of paintings are quite forgiving and you can jump from area to area to fix certain things. Then I'm just going to finish this off with a very dark silhouette for the foreground, making the shapes very distinct compared to the rest of the painting. Moving along to the second painting, I'm going to paint some telephone poles, and for this I made sure that the brush I'm using is either quite small or comes to a fine point, and I'm going to paint 3 long vertical lines. The height of the lines will be the height of the telephone pole that you want in your painting, and as it moves further to the right, I'm going to shorten the height. Once I'm done painting the vertical lines, I'm going to add some small horizontal lines close to the top to make like a cross shape, then dots on top of the horizontal lines and the vertical lines, and then 2 diagonal lines on the bottom of either side of each pole. I'm going to switch to a liner brush now and paint the lines, which I'm going to connect from each pole, and I found out that it wasn't the best idea to use my liner brush, but to just stick with a small size brush because the liner brush has a longer length and I think it suits more for larger scale paintings, and the lines ended up a bit thicker than what I had in mind. Once I'm done painting the telephone poles, I'm going to add some mountains and bushes around the bottom of the painting. Again, I'm using quite a thin consistency to begin with. I'm just roughly placing the elements as I slowly move on to the foreground. Once I'm quite happy with the placement, I'm just going to add a thicker consistency and paint on top of it. Make sure that the previous layer is dry or else you'll end up pulling some of the paint off instead. And remember, you can always use a hairdryer to dry some parts off if you want to layer on top of it really quickly. And I forgot to mention that the colors I used for this one is a mixture of purple and ultramarine blue to paint the additional elements. I used the exact same color for the foreground too, but in a much thicker consistency. As the objects get further and further, they are less visible and the colors also become a little bit more dull. For the foreground, I wanted to add a tiny house and also a little bit of grass because I want to add a little bit more detail in the foreground. And to finish it off, I'm going to also add 3 birds on the telephone line. And we're on to the last painting. For this, I'm going to paint some clouds from either side. I'm also going to tweak some parts of the sky again. By the way, for any of these paintings, you can also create your own shapes and silhouettes or tweak any certain elements according to your interest. For this, because the sky has a bit more of a warmer tone, I'm going to use purple for the silhouettes. And since I want the foreground to be a bit darker and cooler, I'm going to add some ultramarine blue and a bit of black to the mix. Before I added the bushes at the back, I lightly wet the background just a touch so the paint blurs out a little bit, but I'm also going to paint on top of this later, and as it gets towards the bottom, I painted horizontal lines to depict a touch of water reflection. Then, because I want the water to have the colors of the sky, I'm going to move straight away to the foreground, and for this, I'm going to add the ultramarine and black into the purple mix. And again, I'm going to first do a wet on wet technique, so I wet the background before putting down the paint to create a blurred effect. Then I switched to my liner brush, and while the background is still cold to the touch, I added some grasses. Depending on how wet the background is, the grass might look very thick, so just be mindful if you're going to paint along to this, and make sure you get the right wetness or dampness of the paper. The clouds are looking a bit weird since the paint traveled down a bit, so I'm going to erase the bottom part, and I'm also going to add a little bit of white to lighten up the clouds because I find that it's looking a bit too harsh for my liking. I'm going to move on with some foliage now, and switching back to my liner brush, I'm going to still paint in a thin consistency, and I'm painting the foliage quite tall so it stands against the light peachy color from the water reflection. As some of the foliage started to dry, I found that it was looking a bit too light, so I added a thicker consistency and painted on top of it. But don't worry if each of the foliage that you painted looks slightly different in terms of the value. That will just help with the illusion of which part of the painting is a bit more further at the back and which part comes forward in the painting. And once I'm done painting a few of them, I'm going to add larger ones in a very thick consistency, and this is going to be part of the foreground, so you can paint in a bit more detail for each wildflower. I think there's a certain beauty about loose watercolor paintings, and that's somehow to make every stroke that you make meaningful, which is not something that I'm comfortable with yet. But hopefully, as I paint more landscape paintings, I'll be able to control higher water ratio. I always find it really annoying when the paper warps too much when I'm using a lot of water, so if I'm able to plan ahead of what to paint next instead of jumping from place to place, that will be very handy. I decided to start with something easy, and that's to paint silhouettes. So I'm keeping the colors quite minimalistic here, and I focus more on depicting the shapes. I don't think it's the subject that puts me off because I actually enjoy landscape painting with acrylics, so I think it's mostly like technical issues that I'm not too used to with using watercolor in a certain way. Yeah, so I hope you guys are patient with me. I will probably make a lot of mistakes when I paint these landscape paintings, but hopefully I'll keep learning because I find that landscape is actually a very fun subject to paint. Anyway, getting back to the painting, before I add the stars to the sky, I'm going to do some final touch-ups to fix the values and things like that. So this is a good time for you to go back to your paintings and add some details or darken certain areas. I ended up adding some tree branches on the middle one and darkened certain spots for the bushes. And last but not least, I squeezed out some white gouache and used a tiny toothbrush to splatter for the stars. I don't like going too heavy-handed on this, so just take your time. If you accidentally made a mistake or added too much white gouache, you can also go back to it by re-wetting the area and take the white gouache off with a damp brush, but at the same time you might also end up taking some of the paint off from the background. So once the spot is completely dry, you can add the sky color again so you have a clean background. I also like to go back with my brush and enlarge certain stars or add smaller dots manually for the stars if I couldn't get to certain spots with my toothbrush. And once you're done, all you have to do now is just take off the masking tape slowly, and that's it. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end. I think I might do more landscape paintings in the future because I do enjoy the process of painting this, and I hope you enjoyed the speed painting too. Anyway, that's it for today. Have a good day or night depending on where you are from, and I'll see you at the next video. Bye!